All right, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us today on Juneteenth. My name is Asia Barn, and I am Manager of Program Initiatives here at the Freedom Center. Thank you again so much for coming to our panel, Juneteenth, a legacy of race and identity in North America. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists today. They will go through their lectures, and then we'll have some discussion, and then we'll do Q&A if we have time. So thank you again for coming, and first I will introduce Dr. Carl Jacoby, who is a professor of history at Columbia University, specializing in environmental borderlands and Native American history. His books include Shadows at Dawn, A Borderland Massacre and the Violence of History, Crimes Against Nature, Squatters, Poachers, Thieves, and Hidden History of American Conservation, and of course, The Strange Career of William Ellis, the Texas slave who became a Mexican millionaire. And we can also welcome Dr. Maria Hamac, who is a Mexican historian of U.S. slavery, the Black experience in Mexico, liberation in North America. Her work centers on Black women to recover their experiences in geographies in order to connect through a gender lens the history of slavery, freedom, and abolition that shaped and linked Mexico, U.S., and Canada. She will soon be joining us in Ohio at the History Department at The Ohio State University. So if we could go ahead and give them a round of applause and welcome.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you to Christopher and Dr. Jacoby for inviting me to be here with you today. It is an absolute dream to be at the Freedom Center and be able to share some of my work as part of your Juneteenth celebrations. So let's begin. Ever since people had been held enslaved, they had resisted and they had pursued freedom. And Black women were and had been at the forefront of these pursuits. Contrary to the histories that have told us that women escape bondage less than men, the records that I have found in Mexican archives, in US archives, and Canadian archives for that matter, clearly show women at the forefront. And what I have learned is that when you find women, you find children, you find men, you find the families. And as historian Jennifer Morgan explains, finding women in history requires a reading that privileges utterances that meant to be small and insignificant, a reading that rejects the notion that women were passive or unconscious observers of men's radical resistance. So I've been looking for women since I started doing this work. And the work that I bring to the table aims to help widen the timeline, the geographies, and the actors of liberation, abolition, and the Underground Railroad that shaped our shared histories in North America. And I've traced the lives and experiences of many women who challenged U.S. slavery and pursued freedom in Mexican spaces by crafting their own channels of liberation, what we can consider underground railroads of sorts that led them south to Mexico. And while I trace Black women who reached Mexican spaces as early as the 1700s, mid-1700s or 1750s, today I will share a few stories anchored in the antebellum period to keep Juneteenth at the center and to showcase why this is a history that unites the US and Mexico. So in the late 1840s and 1850s, several groups of enslaved and free Black persons and Native people fled to Mexico. This exodus was forced by US Indian removal policies and the institution of chattel slavery in the US. After many failed attempts at diplomacy with the United States government, these groups of Black and Native people were forced to leave places like Florida for reservations in Oklahoma and Kansas, and other spaces in the Midwest. Once in Oklahoma and Kansas, in these regions, these groups, which were of Native and Black Native ancestry, were facing re-enslavement because they had been free. And so they refused to go back or face re-enslavement or go back into bondage. And so at that point, many of those groups decided to leave and go to Mexico. At that point, two men, Wildcat and John Horse, which were the two main leaders, helped map and plan a route to officially leave those reservations and go to Mexico, and starting in the later months of 1849. The Mexican government recorded that on July 13th of 1850, a group of more than 700 Black and Native men, women, and children had crossed into Mexican territory, passing through Piedras Negras near the U.S. town of Eagle Pass, or it's like the sister cities, Eagle Pass and Piedras Negras. These groups engineered communities, mostly in northern Coahuila, and since their arrival there, sought to claim not only freedom, but protections and citizenship, importantly. And their freedom fighting and efforts paid off because by September 9th of 1854, the Mexican government recognized them as official settlers. And by 1859, they had secured not only freedom, but rights, protections, and citizenship that Mexico had. Although the experiences of John Horse and Wildcat are often well known and documented, particularly how both leaders went all the way to Mexico to procure these provisions, the roles of women who also led these efforts alongside them are often obscured. The development and success of the communities such as El Nacimiento in Coahuila was certainly not only because of John Horse and Wildcat and the other men that arrived in Mexico, but because of women who alongside them reached Mexico, women such as Susan July, Juana Horse, Nancy Kibitz, Kitty Johnson, and Becky Simmons. Their labor and their oral histories and traditions were passed down to generation, and allows us to better understand and situate their stories and experiences. Becky Simmons left her oral history, which was taken and written down in 1930, and the quote that I've highlighted here on this slide offers us a glimpse into her experience of crossing the river to reach Mexico. And this allows us to better understand the lives of those who settled these communities of El Nacimiento, which are today called the Mascogo communities today. And I'll let you know, it has been up, so I'm not going to read it all, but it basically, she explains what she felt and experienced as she crossed the river with children and other women and other men. It is also important to note that while I said the term Mascogo, and usually Mascogo is a term used to refer to Black Seminole people, a lot of the individuals that lived and settled in Nacimiento in Coahuila do self-identify as Mascogo, but a lot of the individuals were not necessarily of Black Seminole ancestry. Several families who settled there as well were of Black Creek ancestry, such as families like the Warriors, Factors, Wilsons, Graysons, while others had no Black native lineage, but they were, Black Americans who had been enslaved and had escaped and gone there to be free. And I will talk more in a few minutes about the Mascogo and how their stories are relevant to the history of Juneteenth. So I want to share a few slides to tell you about freedom in Mexico and what shaped freedom in Mexico, to give you an overview of how Black liberation materialized south of US slavery. Did that work? Okay. There. For instance, freedom in Mexico is shaped by Mexico's legal abolition processes. And I put some of the most important laws up there in the slide. And I'm not going to read them, but you can read through them. The official abolition of slavery in Mexico was 1829. And I wanted to share here that Mexico has had 2 Black presidents so far. And here in the US, we've only had 1. So I thought that was a neat point to mention. But another pressing point that I wanted to drive through is that many of these laws that you see up there were provoked by processes fought for by Afro-Mexicans who had long spearheaded freedom processes for Mexico. So Black people, since their arrival in Mexico during and throughout the colonial era, were too very active in their pursuits of freedom, and thereby in the pursuits of having Mexico be a place where slavery was no more. Freedom in Mexico was not just shaped by Afro-Mexicans and legislations like those that I placed in the previous slide. It was also shaped by networks of assistance procured and established by enslaved Black Americans who sought to reach Mexico to be free. These networks materialized in many different ways. As you see here on the slides, many Mexicans and Native people often offered assistance, but it were Black people who had to negotiate to secure safe passage and that assistance they received. We have records, such as this one on the screen, that, or this one, what's that? We have records that show Mexican officials granting 246 pesos, right here, for food and supplies to the recently arrived group of Mascogo groups who reached Mexico in 1850, of which Becky Simmons was part of. And you see individuals and groups heading for Mexico had also needed to broker networks with indigenous groups. For instance, in the 1830s, many people had to broker networks in the Comancherias, where they could, if not necessarily get assistance, at least get safe passage through those native lands. And here you see a Choctaw individual who had been writing passes and helping people escape, for which he actually got in trouble. Other networks to freedom also materialized through active efforts of Black abolitionists, such as you see here, these two. You see here in the gray is an article written by a Black woman from Philadelphia in the early 1840s, who wrote to the Liberator voicing her support to situate Mexico, not Canada, as a freedom destination. And at least this helped endorse Mexico as a destination for freedom. She wrote, "Where is that country to which we may remove and thus become free and equal?" This is part of what she writes here. And she says, "I believe that country to be Mexico. Mexico," she argued, "was an independent nation where the prospects for Black people were far better," and I'm quoting her, "whereas in this country, the United States," she wrote, "we are kept poor, and of course cannot aspire to anything more than what we have always been." And so you also see other abolitionists, such as Samuel Webb, who wrote this right here, actively writing to the Mexican government and asking important questions to better understand what Mexico had to offer Black Americans in terms of freedom. And there were two things that he asked, or two things that I learned by looking at these records. One is that freedom was not the only thing being pursued in Mexico. Equality, as he mentions here, equality, citizenship, and land were too part of what was being pursued. And two, I also learned that freedom in Mexico was undeniably shaped by Black Americans, by their mobilities, by their resistance, and their liberation practices, by themselves. And Black women, as I mentioned before, were at the forefront of these pursuits, of these mobilities, and of this freedom fighting, especially freedom fighting south of US slavery. Women like Matilda Hens, for instance, not only had to craft her own escape from her enslaver, she had to create her own pathway to freedom to Mexico. And she made it there safely with her daughter Harriet. Sometime in the 1840s, Matilda reached Mexico to be free, but her enslaver wanted her back, so he paid some men who were slave hunters to go find her whereabouts in Mexico. And these slave hunters did go into Mexico and located mother and daughter, and then they went back to the enslaver who was in Texas to tell him exactly where she was living. And on the night of August 20th of 1850, this enslaver crossed illegally into Mexico, talking about illegal immigration, right? Crossed illegally into Mexico to go find her with the intention to kidnap her and her daughter and bring them back to US slavery. So he breaks into her home and immediately tries to take her. But Matilda fought, and she fought with everything she had. She started beating him and trying to prevent him from taking her. She started screaming at the top of her lungs until neighbors came to her help. One of them showed up with guns, and together they were able to stop the enslaver from taking her. And together, they went to the local jail where they lodged the former enslaver there, and he remained there for about 10 or 11 months. But she never returned to slavery. She remained free in Mexico. And so you clearly see her fight to not just be free, but to remain free. And freedom, as I've also learned, was, for Black Americans, was very fragile. It was fragile in Mexico, as it was in the US, and as it certainly was in Canada as well. But how is Juneteenth relevant to the stories of liberation? Juneteenth is celebrated not only in the US, but in Mexican soil. And we can trace these origins to this group that arrived in the 1850s to Mexico. By October of 1850, the Mexican government passed the Código de Colonización, and which offered not only freedom, but freedom. It offered citizenship and land to Black Americans who arrived, particularly Black Native Americans, like the Black Seminoles who arrived, through Article 15 of that colonization code. By July 26 of 1852, these groups had secured 4 sitios or land grants. The biggest one was El Nacimiento and 4 others in Durango. By September 9, 1854, Mexico had ratified this code and offered full protections in citizenship. And interestingly, by 1936, President Lázaro Cárdenas granted them 3,000 more acres to raise more cattle. And it were in these communities in Coahuila that began to observe, that they were the ones who began to observe Juneteenth celebrations, and today continue celebrating this Juneteenth. So in Coahuila, Mexico, Juneteenth is called El Día de los Negros, or the Day of the Black People, and it began as a means to show solidarity with their brethren in the US, particularly as a means to celebrate freedom in general. And I've consulted with scholars from these communities who, as Doug Sibat right here, is one of the individuals who have been researching this history or their own history. And he offered that the communities in Mexico may have started celebrating Juneteenth as early as the late 1870s. Juneteenth celebrations starting in Mexico in the late 1820s make a lot of sense, particularly given that some of the settlers from El Nacimiento began to move across the border into Texas and ended up settling Brackettville, Texas. Both Nacimiento and Brackettville were, have become sister cities because it's part of the same families have moved across back and forth. But in Doug Sibat's words, as he told me, he said, Maria, 1870 was the year the Seminole Scouts were formed. The Scouts and their families came into contact with Buffalo soldiers and their families who had experienced slavery. And there were former slaves living all over West Texas that married into Black Native families. The Muskogee people joined in with their scouting kinfolk, and often partied with them. So that may have been the origins of Juneteenth in Mexico, or at least the origins of when the first celebrations in El Nacimiento began happening. Today, Juneteenth celebrations are held in El Nacimiento every year. So to conclude, Juneteenth is a history that up until recently was widely misunderstood, particularly perhaps more out South Texas. Some people often thought that Juneteenth, as I did, that it marked the day that all slaves were freed in the country. But as we have come to know, that wasn't so. Juneteenth marked the day that federal troops arrived in Galveston on June 19th of 1865 and notified the more than 250,000 Black Americans in Texas that they were free and that they had been free for 2 years. So they arrived to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. So today, Juneteenth is a federal holiday observed across the United States, and it is my hope that beyond being a celebration that marks a freedom that was given or granted on June 19th of 1865 to Black Americans in Texas, that it is one that helps all of us acknowledge and visibilize the fight for freedom that Black Americans themselves had to push forth, procure, and endure in order to be free. And if you read the very order that was read in Galveston, you can see clearly how it demonstrates that fight for freedom I stressed earlier. The struggle for liberation that in many ways continued after, which Carl will speak to you more about now. So I'll leave you with these words. Juneteenth commemorates a long history of the fight for freedom by Black Americans. This is a history that is relevant and foundational, not only for the US, but for Mexico as well. It is a history that can help us challenge the racism and anti-Blackness that I have found so prevalent, not just in the US, but in Mexico as well, and certainly in Canada as well. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Juneteenth. And I'm really delighted to be here. I wanted to thank everyone who made this event possible, particularly Asia Bard and Christopher Miller. And I also wanted to say what a pleasure it is for me to speak with Dr. Hammock, who's someone I've known for quite a long time, but I've never had the pleasure of actually sharing a stage with her and sharing research with her before. So my talk and Dr. Hammock's talk, they converge at this moment of Juneteenth. Hers ends, as it were, with Juneteenth, and mine is going to start with Juneteenth. And the idea behind structuring our presentations in this way was to allow you to see Juneteenth from multiple directions, both the history that led up to Juneteenth and then the history that flows out of Juneteenth, so the before and the after, as it were. We structured the event this way because we wanted to emphasize two important facts about Juneteenth. The arrival of U.S. forces in Galveston, Texas in June 19, 1865, did mark a significant historical moment. Throughout the Civil War, Texas was so distant that it had been left practically untouched by the conflict. There was, for example, no major battle of the Civil War that was fought on Texas soil. And in fact, the number of enslaved peoples in Texas increased during the war as enslavers from elsewhere in the Confederacy forced enslaved African Americans into Texas in an effort to keep them from self-emancipating by running off to the Union Army lines. Ironically, of course, this only brought enslaved peoples closer to the US-Mexico border, and it increased their ability to run off to Mexico, which in 1857 had rewritten its constitution to state that any person who set foot on Mexican soil was immediately free. And this was clearly a measure designed as a rebuke to Mexico's northern neighbor, to the United States, which was the only close-by place that had enslavement at the time. And as Dr. Hammock's stories demonstrate really so well, this knowledge of Mexico as a land of liberty circulated widely among the enslaved. So as one freedman from Texas, Felix Haywood, remembered, sometimes someone would come along and try to get us to run up north and be free. We used to laugh at that. There was no reason to run up north. All we had to do was walk, but walk south, and we'd be free as soon as we crossed the Rio Grande. That comes from the WPA slave narratives, which are a really famous source a lot of you have probably heard about. One other source that allows us to get a sense of this deep interconnection between enslaved African Americans in Texas and Mexico and Mexicans are actually these runaway slave ads. They're problematic sources in the sense that, of course, they're written by enslavers, but they also do provide these very vivid portraits of runaway enslaved peoples. And I noticed that they actually have in the exhibit halls here reprinted some of these as well. So I just wanted to give you a few examples here. This one, the important thing here, he's making his way into Mexico. So clearly they're already thinking about Mexico well before Juneteenth. Here's another one, again. He's determined to make his way to Mexico. This ad here, I think, speaks even more to these deep connections. This is someone who it says is going to try to pass himself off as a Mexican, presumably by knowing some Spanish language and being familiar with Mexican culture. And this speaks to the interactions that were happening sort of in the fields between enslaved African Americans and Mexicans at this time. And just one more for you, and this one speaks really directly. It says that he speaks a few words of Spanish. So clearly these people had these interconnections with Mexico. Even before they get to Mexico, they're already thinking about Mexico. One other form of evidence that we can look at would be the famous, or I should really say infamous, Texas Rangers. This really originates as a slave-catching force, and they're designed really to stop enslaved people from self-emancipating into Mexico during this time. I would say one of the things that I find in sort of the afterlife of slavery is that, of course, we've begun to have a very slow reckoning with the use of Confederate names and actually the use of indigenous mascots in sports. There's been no similar effort to think about the Texas Rangers, as slave catchers, and the appropriateness of using this in sports. And it's a little bit eerie, I have to say, to be speaking here very close to the baseball stadium and to know that the Cincinnati Reds sometimes play the Texas Rangers here, right in the shadow of this very important Freedom Center. In any event, this brings us to two of the points that Dr. Hammack and I want to emphasize. The first is the fact that thousands, and I was just asking Dr. Hammack about this before our talk, we're estimating about 10,000 enslaved people escaped to Mexico in the antebellum period. The fact that 10,000 African Americans escaped to Mexico before 1865 suggests that enslaved people, of course, already had a notion of freedom. They didn't need U.S. troops to show up and sort of tell them they were free. They already knew that they should be free. What they did need was for the U.S. Army to stop enslavers to prevent African Americans from exercising this freedom. And the second point is that even after Juneteenth, as Professor Hammack was saying, this freedom was very fragile. African Americans continued to struggle to make the promise of freedom into reality, and Mexico continued to play a very large role in these African American attempts at liberation. So we need to be thinking about a multi-directional, multi-dimensional underground railroad, as it were, one that runs not only north but also south to Mexico, and one that also runs later than we would think, that runs in the years after 1865 as well. Now, of course, it would be naive to claim that Mexico, which does share aspects in common with the U.S., it was created through the conquest of indigenous peoples. Mexico has its own process of enslavement. It would be naive to claim that it was unmarked by racism. One of the things that I think is most interesting is the sort of Mexican denial of the reality of Afro-Mexicanidad, the idea of peoples of African descent in Mexico. It wasn't until the most recent census in 2020 that people could define themselves as Afro-Mexicano in the census. So you've seen that sign there on the left. The person is saying proudly Afro-Mexicana, and that I'm going to count myself for the census in 2020. But Mexico never developed a Jim Crow legal system of racial apartheid akin to what happened in the US. And as a result, for many African Americans crossing the border to Mexico offered a welcome respite from the constant oppressions of US racism. As Langston Hughes remarked upon crossing into Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, from El Paso, Texas, in the early 1900s, it was strange to find that just by stepping across an invisible line into Mexico, a Negro could buy a beer in any bar, sit anywhere in the movies, or eat in any restaurant, so suddenly did Jim Crow disappear. In addition to Langston Hughes, we might also point to other prominent African Americans like the boxer Jack Johnson, or Henry Flipper, who's the first black graduate of West Point. All these people spent significant amounts of their time in Mexico as a refuge from US racism. To illuminate some of the ways that Mexico continued to operate as a space of freedom for African Americans after Juneteenth, I wanted to tell you the story of a rather remarkable individual from Texas. He was born into a small South Texas town named Victoria and was a young child when Juneteenth took place in 1865. His parents named him William Henry Ellis, but many others came to know him as Guillermo Enrique Eliseo. He was arguably the first African American on Wall Street, where he had an office next to the preeminent banker of the era, J.P. Morgan, but many at the time never imagined he was an African American and instead believed he was a Mexican. And a lot of this is drawn from my most recent book here, and the subtitle kind of gives away the plot: The Texas Slave Who Became a Mexican Millionaire. Now, in many respects, Ellis, or Eliseo, was the quintessential individual of the Gilded Age, the self-made man. He was self-made in the conventional sense that he came from humble circumstances yet rose to economic success. And he was self-made in the sense that he also refashioned his identity, building on the deep connections that existed between African Americans and Mexican in Texas. Although he was born into slavery, his hometown was one of the few places in Texas where whites, blacks, and Mexicans had lived side by side. In much of the rest of Texas, white enslavers worried that Mexicans would help enslaved African Americans to escape, actually ethnically cleanse most of their towns of Mexicans to remove any Mexican presence. By working and living alongside Mexicans, Ellis learned Spanish as a young boy and became familiar with Mexican culture. And thanks to his Spanish skills, he then worked as a translator for a white businessman in Victoria who did business across the border in Mexico. From here, it was but a small step for speaking for the white businessman and arranging his deals for him to speaking and arranging deals for himself. Around the age of 20, William Ellis suddenly disappeared from his hometown, only to reappear in San Antonio, the largest city in South Texas and a hub for cross-border trade with Mexico. When he reappeared, however, he began to tell everyone he was a Mexican and that his name was Guillermo Enrique Eliseo, which, if you know Spanish, this is just translating his name, William Henry Ellis, into Spanish. From here, he eventually moved to New York City, and which was then, as now, as the financial and commercial center of the United States. Now, you may be asking yourself, how was it that an African American was able to reinvent themselves so successfully as a Mexican? And I think some of the images that I've been able to locate in newspapers give us a beginning of a sense of how he did this. And I just wanted to show you a few of them here. So these are, you can see he's always very well dressed, and he always has this mustache. Just march you through some of these. And here, he almost looks like the Monopoly Man, right? Which I say is a little bit as a joke, but also it's real because the Monopoly Man is a figure of the capitalist or the entrepreneur, and he's really tapping into that image. And so it's really striking. This is from the newspapers of the era, where he often appeared in the newspapers. And this is one of the photos I was able to find of him. Now, if you look at this photo, and of course, it's hard for me to see it with fresh eyes knowing his history, he very much looks like a black man to me there. And it's really interesting to think that someone who could, in a certain look that way, could actually convince a lot of white Americans that he was a Mexican who looked much more like this. But one of Ellis's secrets is that he very much understood what white people wanted to see, and he knew how to manipulate their stereotypes about both African Americans and Mexicans. The turn of the last century was marked by this huge boom in U.S. investment in Mexico. A lot of the era's new innovations all depended on resources from Mexico. So copper was essential for all the new electric appliances, the new technology of the telephone. Rubber and oil were important for the new invention of the automobile. Even things like vanilla and chocolate from Mexico were really important for the growing candy trade, the sort of junk food in the United States. So many American investors had no idea how were they going to begin to make inroads into Mexico. And so knowing someone like William Guillermo Eliseo, who circulated at very high high levels in Mexico and could facilitate introductions and investments, he became this very useful person to know. And Ellis very much embraced his image of Mexico as a land of riches through his elegant grooming and dress, his carefully waxed mustache, his impeccable clothing, his fine jewelry, and he would give these elegant gifts of Mexican leatherwork and Mexican cigars to everyone. So note that he's not pretending to just be any Mexican. He's not pretending to be a campesino or a Mexican peon. What he's offering is his vision of a wealthy upper-class Mexican from Mexico City. So he's passing not only from one race to another, as it were, but he's also passing from one class to another. He's hiding his childhood of enslavement on a Texas enslavement camp in favor of presenting himself as an elite Mexican. Here's some of the stocks that he was involved in, and then here's just an image of his office on Wall Street. And if you can read in the window, what I think is key to note there is it's talking about Mexican and Cuban investments, that he's the person who can open up Mexico for you. So under these circumstances, a lot of whites were happy to take Guillermo Eliseo at face value and accept his stories about being Mexican. They were helped too by the idea that race was so obvious and self-evident that one could supposedly easily tell whites apart from blacks. So once white people invested money with Guillermo Eliseo, they were also in essence investing in his story. Otherwise, they had to admit that race was not necessarily as easy to distinguish as they believed, and they'd actually been in close contact with an African American. And because of this logic, one finds an increasing number of prominent whites who vouch for Guillermo Eliseo and the fact that he's Mexican, eventually including the U.S. Secretary of State, Francis Loomis, and even the U.S. President at the time, Teddy Roosevelt. Although Ellis's reinvention of himself as Mexican enabled him in part on an individual level to escape some of the worst of Jim Crow in the U.S., he also sought to make these advantages accessible to other African Americans. In 1880, he signed agreements with the Mexican government to bring African American immigrants to Mexico, which at the time thought it was underpopulated and needed skilled immigrants to help unlock its rich natural resources. In 1895, Ellis achieved his most remarkable step in this effort. He signed an agreement with the Mexican hacienda that was pioneering the cultivation of cotton in Mexico, and the hacienda agreed to finance the resettlement of African Americans in northern Mexico. Working clandestinely in Alabama and Georgia, within a matter of months, Ellis arranged for close to 1,000 African Americans to abandon their homes in the U.S. and move to Mexico. The remarkable enthusiasm of so many African Americans in the Deep South to relocate to Mexico underscores the deep hold that Mexico still had on the African American imagination as a site of potential emancipation. The flyer that Ellis distributed to drum up interest in the project leaned into these images, describing Mexico as a land that extends to all of its citizens the same treatment, equal rights to all, special privileges to none. And many of the African Americans who joined the venture described the railroad taking them south as a paradise train and put signs on the railroad cars that read, "Mexico, the land of liberty for the black man." This migration of African Americans to Mexico ignited a firestorm of controversy in the US. I'm sorry this one is so blurry, but I did want to share there's countless newspaper articles about this, and I wanted to share just a few. This one, the important thing, is it's an interview that Ellis did, and he's talking about he thinks that 100,000 African Americans are going to move to Mexico at this time. And then here's another one, which is a colonization scheme with a brilliant outlook. And then there's a quote at the end from Ellis. It got cut off a little bit here, but he's talking about, "We suffer more in the South than at any time since slavery." And of course, 1895, this is right before Plessy versus Ferguson, right as Jim Crow is really getting this terrible grip on the South. And he's looking across the border for a place where there isn't Jim Crow. Many whites began to realize to their sort of dismay that there was a good chance that a significant number of African Americans would relocate to Mexico, depriving the U.S. of a cheap and exploitable labor force. It didn't work out this way for reasons that I can get into in the question and answer session, but this anxiety on the part of whites clearly demonstrated a guilty conscience over their mistreatment of African Americans, as well as a recognition that Mexico was an attractive alternative for blacks given the absence of the color line there. There's still some people in northern Mexico who trace their ancestry to the African Americans who relocated there in the 1890s with Ellis. And in much the same way, Ellis's own family ends up being divided by the U.S.-Mexico border. Ellis died in Mexico City shortly after the Mexican Revolution and was buried in the Mexican capital. His widow and children moved to Mexico after his death and eventually intermarry into the Mexican community. The two sides of Ellis's family, the descendants of his sisters, who remained in the U.S. and continued to identify as African American, and his immediate descendants, the ones who moved to Mexico, eventually lost touch with one another until I reintroduced them in the process of researching and writing my book about William Ellis. And we've sometimes done presentations together. This is from one that we did together at UCLA. The Mexican side of the family is sort of closest to me there, and the African American side is at the other end of the table there. Ellis's grandson, who's in the middle there wearing the white shirt and the black coat, he knew his grandfather was American, but he didn't know his grandfather was African American until I explained it to him in Spanish during one of our early phone conversations. And I wanted to leave you with his response, which demonstrates how much the US-Mexico border separated not only two nations, but two different ways of thinking about race. So I recorded an oral history with Ellis's grandson, and I asked him, what did it mean to discover that you had an African-American grandfather? And he explained, well, in Mexico, we think about ourselves as mestizo. And mestizo literally means mixed in Spanish. And usually we think of mestizo as a mixture of indigenous and Spanish. And I'm indigenous, Spanish, and African-American. But I'm still mestizo. It doesn't dramatically change how I think about myself. Now, of course, in contrast, in the US, the prevailing logic here is the one-drop law, and this is something that gets written into legislation in the early 20th century. And again, here, the key phrase, a white person is one with no trace whatever of blood of another race, right? So in the American racial imaginary, if you had any African-American ancestry, no matter how remote, this would potentially really transform how you thought about yourself, because in the American racial imaginary, blackness trumps other forms of racial identity. So to go back to this photo, it's the same family. You can even notice there are a lot of family resemblances. They look very much alike. They all share in common white, African-American, and Native ancestry. Yet the Mexican side identifies as mestizo, as Mexican, and the US side identifies as African-American. It's not that one side is wrong and one side is right. They're both right. It really depends on what side of the border you're on, and this shows that race is very much a cultural construct. It's not a biological reality. Now, all of this history is embedded in our current US-Mexico border, which still operates as a racial dividing line. We typically think about borders as keeping people out, but it's important to emphasize that for a lot of its early history, the US-Mexico border was about keeping people in, specifically trying to keep in African Americans and prevent them from self-emancipating to Mexico. Now, so history doesn't repeat, but I think we can say that it rhymes. And since I know that the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center is concerned not only with history but the present, I wanted to close with this somewhat this somewhat disturbing picture from 2021 of the Border Patrol chasing Haitian migrants along the US-Mexico border. Now, once we realize that the Border Patrol in many ways is a new incarnation of the Texas Rangers, of that slave-catching force that I was talking to you about from the antebellum period, we can see how much our current border still operates to limit black mobility and black attempts to limit freedom and liberty. Great. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
All right, let's go ahead and give them one more round of applause. And again, thank you both so much for being here. Your work is so important, and we're so glad to be able to share it with our audience today and in the future for our audience, just in case so you can know, we are currently filming this and we will have it online for access for later on. So when you want to have these discussions, please feel free to access our archival library on our website to really gain more traction and understanding of this topic. So first, I kind of want to go into where we stopped, thinking about what's not stopping. The main thing I took out of reading your text, Dr. Jacoby, and reading your work as well, Dr. Hamak, is thinking about the villainization, in a way, of Mexican culture. I think it's very fascinating that once Mexico became an ally, that's when we went to war against them. That's when they became something to look down on, or we look at the border as, oh, we have to be protected, when in reality, it was protecting us. So kind of thinking about the concepts of border patrols and that invisible line that's very much a part of U.S. culture, but not necessarily Mexican culture. Why is it important to talk about that?
I'm going to go first.
Yes.
I mean, that's a great question. And one of the things that I think I've been thinking about a lot is, why do we know so much less about the so-called Underground Railroad to Mexico instead of the one north? And I think there's several factors that are really key. One of them is, frankly, just racism towards Mexico. There's a sense that Mexico could never be this sort of space of liberation, that people just are, Americans don't think that way. And I think the other thing is the way that we often tell the Underground Railroad story, not necessarily here at this museum, which is much more sophisticated, but the one in the popular culture. In some ways, it's very reassuring to Americans, because it suggests that there was still this space of freedom, that the United States still had this space of freedom, and so that going north was a way of achieving freedom. But I think that bringing Mexico in totally changes that, because you realize, particularly after 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act, North is not, I mean, it's always, North was very racist anyways, but also after 1850, you're very vulnerable to being, re-enslaved. But Mexico takes this very hard line. They rewrite their constitution to prevent this, and there's constant interest on the part of the U.S. to negotiate some sort of treaty to return people who had self-emancipated themselves to Mexico to the United States, and Mexico adamantly refuses to do that. And so I just think it's very jarring for Americans who really are trained to look down on Mexico to realize that Mexico really is just this space of potential liberation, much more than the United States for much of its history.
And I completely agree with that. And I would add to some of the reasons of why perhaps we don't learn about these histories is considering who was writing about these histories and their lenses. Early historians were very biased or racist in many ways, and so they weren't interested in telling some stories, and they were only interested in highlighting others. So what I have found doing this work and being in archives, for instance, I'll talk about Mexican archives, is that the stories of women like Matilde, or some of the stories that I shared and more, they're there. They have been there in the archives. And my question was, why have people not written about this 50 years ago, 20 years ago? These records have been there for over 100 years. So why have they not been written about? And I go back to what you're saying. I think it is, it may be because in many ways how early historians or how early people thought about Mexicans was in a way that perhaps situated Mexicans as, and the records say, they were uncivilized. The idea of Mexican, like they were in many ways referred as mongrel people. How can mongrel people or uncivilized people banner freedom as opposed to people in the US who had this God-given right of manifest destiny, right? They can banner freedom, they can push freedom, but how would Mexicans do that? When in reality, the sources tells us that there were these processes in Mexico that were being pushed forth and fought for, not only, but what we consider Mexicans, but by Black Mexicans themselves who had for generations been freed already in Mexico. So Yeah.
And kind of going on this theme of racial identities and connections, why do you believe in Mexico it was easier to be a black person than it is in the United States, besides concepts of like Jim Crow, like culturally or just internally? Was there a reason that maybe that division wasn't as necessary?
One of the things that I find very often is this word amalgamation. And I'm sure you've come across this word. Amalgamation wasn't a dreaded circumstance. I come across this sentence in Mexico as it was in the US. So intermarrying, mixture, mestizaje was in many ways part of the Mexican heritage, you know. So I believe that is part of this, why it wasn't something that was dreaded, or it happened from the very beginning when people from various African countries were forced to Mexico. Mexico was one of the, if the second, not the first was Brazil, benefiters of the African slave trade. So African peoples arrived in Mexico in the early colonial period, and since they had been part of the Mexican nation, the roots, a part of what constructed Mexico, the only difference is that their roles and their presence had been invisibilized for many centuries.
I think it speaks too to the history, the very troubled history between the U.S. and Mexico, because of course, you know, the U.S. invades Mexico and takes half of this country in large part to extend the realm of slavery. And from the Mexican perspective, Mexico, the United States just seems like this country that's, you know, obsessed with slavery, obsessed with expanding slavery. And this pushes Mexico all the more to really reject slavery and to be more strongly opposed to slavery. And so I think that's why, like in 1857, after the war with Mexico, they rewrite their constitution to say that anyone who sets foot on Mexican soil is free, because they're really doing that as a rebuke to the U.S., and they're really trying to you know, respond to the racism and enslavement that they see in the United States. So in many respects, that's a kind of, this is why you have to study the history of the U.S. and Mexico go together, because it doesn't make sense if you just think about what's going on in Mexico or the U.S. necessarily. But once you look at them together, you can see how this very troubled, painful history between the two countries would force Mexico towards a ever increasingly sort of anti-slavery, explicitly anti-racist position, because they really do see their, you know, the mistreatment that Mexicans and African Americans have in the United States as being something that's unique to that country, and they really want to distance themselves, their self-image as a nation, from that.
Can I add one more point? And this is something that I learned as I was finishing my PhD. I was defending, and one of my professors made me rethink a lot of the things that I had thought about. So what he told me was, you need to go back to colonization in Mexico and think about who was part of this amalgamation, of this mixture, discussing mestizaje. He's like, if you situate yourself at the beginning of this mestizaje, you will understand that the majority of the people in Mexico were native. The second majority was black. And there was a very small minority of white. And so he asked, what does that mean for mestizaje or for Mexico's black roots? And since then, I had thought about that and try to better understand what that means for Mexicans, or what a Mexican is and who we are. Right. Mestizos, what is mestizaje? It's not necessarily just European and native. It's certainly European, black, and native from the very beginning of mestizaje.
Yeah. Right. And something that we always try to bring up here at the Underground Railroad Freedom Center is thinking about the Civil War in a way that is different from maybe what's taught in everyday life in school. So generally taught, like with the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery ended in 1863. We're taught that the Civil War was about ending slavery, when in reality, it's about the concept of, are we going to expand it to the West now that we stole this land from Mexico? Or are we just going to keep it where it is now that we keep taking land with concepts of manifest destiny that says we have the rights to take this as a country, it's what we're supposed to do, thinking along those lines. And so when we have stories like Ellis's and we have stories like Matilde's, thinking about that difference and that connection with a different space, especially the concept of space, since both of your works kind of think about geography and place, which is, again, something really important to us as an institution as we are currently on the land of Little Africa, which was a safe haven for freedom seekers as well, who came especially from Kentucky. I kind of want us to talk about the importance of geography and maybe that invisible line, and why that's important in the telling of history and the telling of culture and creation of it.
I'm gathering my thoughts. Why don't you go ahead, Maria?
When it comes to geography, so speaking from experience, having been born and raised in Mexico, I grew up not knowing much about Mexico's Black roots or Black presence. And it wasn't until I was in the US where, being in that new geography, I was experiencing being othered. Okay, you're Mexican, you're Latino, you're Hispanic, but also understanding the dynamics, because when I came to the US, I ended up in North Carolina. And so in there, I learned very quickly racial divide. And, you know, that's what I started learning about this. And so one of the things that I hope to better understand is why we only learn about certain geographies being places of freedom as opposed to others. I'll tell you the story of how I got to this work. I was sitting in a class of the history of the Old South, and it was one of those required courses that you have to take as an undergrad. And I was in North Carolina at this point when I was doing this work, and I was sitting there learning about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, and I was very interested. I had never learned about these histories. I didn't really know much about freedom or slavery. The only thing that I knew was that Mexico had abolished slavery roughly 30 years before the US. And that's all I knew. So when my professor was talking about Harriet Tubman, I raised my hand and I asked, "Ooh, who was the Harriet Tubman who led people to Mexico? And can you tell me how many people went there?" And he looked at me and he said, "That's a very good question, Maria. If you find out, let me know." So to me, it was very important to know why it was logical for me to think they were going to Mexico, but that is a geography that is not emphasized or highlighted in history books. So that's what led me to this work, and I think that's also what led me to contact Dr. Jacoby early on, because I was trying to find this history. And I think it's very important that when we talk about liberation, particularly Black liberation, we not only talk about, for instance, Mexico or the US and, you know, what we consider Black liberation, but people that were enslaved in the US shaped Black liberation, not only within the US, but outside, in Mexico, in Canada, in the Caribbean. Many people ended up back in African nations like Sierra Leone. And so it is important to widen our understandings of who fought for freedom and abolition, and that what geographies constitute this fight. And I think that will expand our notions of where freedom was available, what geographies were spaces or safe havens, and where people actually went to fight and be free, fight for and be free.
Yes.
Yeah, that's such an eloquent answer. I don't have much to add, except that what struck me when I was doing my work is that how close the U.S. South is actually to the Mexican North and how closely interrelated they are. And so that there was just so much capacity for people to go south as from the U.S. South. And this continues after the war as well, so that once the railroad opens up, this becomes a free-flowing space where people can move very easily. And it's actually interesting that for much of its history, the border has been very porous, and it's really only in this early moment of enslavement and trying to prevent black movement across the border now, and more recently we've seen this effort to again make a very hard border, kind of return to this very hard border from the antebellum period. But for a lot of time, it was very easy to move back and forth across the border, and so we need to be thinking about this space as not just just the U.S., but embracing a lot of Mexico as well.
I can add one more thing that I also learned through doing this work is you've heard of the Saltwater Railroad, people that went to the Caribbean to be free. And so those are processes that are very much intertwined with the processes of freedom that we see in the geographies like the US, Mexico, and Canada. And I think that when we situate these processes as processes that were not necessarily insular to the US or to North America, but were processes that were part of this larger process of liberation that were going on in the Caribbean, in Haiti, it really makes or gives us a better sense of who was fighting for freedom and who were the abolitionists and how that materialized.
And kind of going to what you're both talking about and really thinking about Alice's story, I kept thinking of the concept of self-narrative. So taking back what is being said about you. So you kind of brought up how Black liberation, in a way, is liberation across North America. In the US, often when Black communities fight for or seek justices, they're labeled as rioters or violent. And I think it's so important to really point out what Dr. Hamak said in thinking about Black liberation kind of being the center of freedom in all spaces. To me, upon observation, Black liberation work is the most democratic thing you could do, because democracy is of the people, making sure that the people are being taken care of. And Black liberation movements leads to the movements of other groups like women, Native Americans, Mesoamericans, once they went between the borders and were working, things along those lines. It's so important to talk about self-narrative and how Ellis took his self-narrative of, instead of I'm going to be a Black man in your space, right, and that's seen as a negative, I'm going to be a Mexican man. Like, why do you believe forming your own self-narrative is so important during antebellum periods as well as maybe now?
Well, I mean, I think everyone should have the right to, narrate their own existence in the world, right? I think I'm just really amazed with Ellis how risky this act was, right? Because he's out there narrating this alternative reality. I didn't get into this in my presentation, but he marries a white woman, which would have been completely, illegal in Texas at the time. And so he's in this high wire act, and he becomes very visible. And so there's one of the things that I think is remarkable about his story is that he's a national figure, and instead of trying to, which often people would try to do, is blend in and sort of obscure themselves, he's actually taking this very prominent role. And what's amazing is he's able to persuade so many people at very high levels that he's actually who he says he is, which I think speaks. And coming from this I've been to Victoria, Texas, a very small, humble town, to come from this very humble background and actually be rubbing elbows with presidents, both the president of Mexico and the president of the United States, just suggests how convincing he was and able to narrate this own story for himself. I should add as well that, though he was fooling white people at the time, African Americans knew who he was. And this comes out. So once he passes away, the Black press writes obituaries about him. They finally claim him as a Black man. And they were quiet about it because on some level it was like a test. Like, if this person, the fact that he was able to succeed so well shows that what prevents Black achievement is not any lack of capacity on African Americans. What it is white racism is preventing this, right? And so African Americans were, I think, secretly proud of William Ellis and everything he could achieve because he demonstrated the capacity that African Americans had to live the kind of lives they wanted to live and narrate their own lives. but they were keeping the other narrations silent until it was the right moment. But it really was a way of proving just the damaging effects of white racism, and how much that was really limiting the black ability to succeed at what they wanted to do.
What I see as important to also to recognize in these stories and histories is that it was black activism and black resistance and black fight who propelled freedom and abolition to materialize. And I'd like to build on the work of someone who presented here a couple years ago, Kelly Carter Jackson, who talks about violence and how, in order to move forward, the fight for freedom, it was a violent act. You had to utilize violence to be able to secure freedom in many ways. And so in my work, I situate individuals who left the US, who challenged slavery and made it to Mexico as freedom fighters. Because as I see it, they fought for everything they had, like William Ellis. Every step of the way, it was a fight. Even for people like Matilda, who I chaired today, she was already living free in Mexico, and she still had to fight to prevent from being kidnapped and returned to bondage. And so that's one of the points that I think it's important to recognize when we think about these histories. And the second is, who were the leaders who were bringing forth abolition? In history, we are taught that the British were the first abolitionists, that they were propelling this. But even in those histories, for instance, in 1826, I found this record where Britain had tried to get a treaty with Mexico, trying to force them to patrol the Gulf of Mexico waters, because they were saying, we're patrolling against the slave trade in the Atlantic, we cannot also patrol your Gulf. You need to do this, and to prevent the slave trade from continuing through the Gulf of Mexico into the US and into Mexico. So Mexico was like, okay, we'll do a treaty, we'll patrol the Gulf. And one of the stipulations that the British had sent was like what to do with people that they found on ships being smuggled or being traded. What Britain suggested to Mexico that they do is, once you find them, you're going to free them, but in order to show that they are free, you have to brand them with an F. So when the Mexican official was reading this, and I could see it because he wrote on the on the margins of the document that he sent back to the British and said, wait, what? We're not going to do that. How about we just give them freedom papers? And then he returns them. And then in the final treaty, they're not going to brand them. They're going to offer freedom papers. But just the notion that when we think about abolitionism, a lot of the times we think about British. But yet the British wanted to brand people to know that they were free. But it was only logical to this Mexican official who was reading this, doing these negotiations, to say, wait, let's just give them freedom papers, like papeles de libertad. Why? So, and that comes to the question that you asked, why in many ways our history has situated Mexicans as villains, as people that didn't know what freedom meant. But clearly, documents like that show us that the difference in thought about freedom and abolition between British and Mexicans. So I think that it's important to dig those archives and hopefully better understand what these freedom processes were and who was propelling these ideas and ultimately secured liberation, which was Black Americans themselves,
So to make sure that we do have time for Q&A, I kind of want to hit 2 questions for each of you. Dr. Jacoby, what do you want people to really take away from Ellis's story in your book? Like, what is, if nothing else, what do you want people to take with them?
Oh, I mean, I have one thing. There's so many things. I mean,
Go for it.
I mean,
Give
one
me
thing
all of
is,
them.
again, just you can't understand U.S. history apart from Mexican history. I think that's just so integral. And I also want people, a little bit the point that I was trying to elaborate, I think looking at those histories together allows us to reconceptualize a little bit how we think about race and understand how much of it is a cultural construct and how much it's much more, it can be much more fluid than we're used to thinking about in the U.S. I think we are used to thinking about U.S. racial categories as the sort of true racial categories, and that race only operates in this one way. But once you bring in Mexican history and the larger history of Latin America, you realize that race is a much more, it operates in many different ways, and it enables you to denaturalize race, because I think we often think about race as a very sort of biological, real thing, and it's real in the sense that it definitely affects lives, but it's not real in the sense that there's anything, biological about it. I think, I guess I would leave it at that too for now. Those two for now.
Fair enough. And Dr. Hammock, what do you want people to really take away from learning about these stories, about these Black women who fought for resistance and freedom?
Like Carl, there's so many things, but if I were to pinpoint what presses me to do this work, like I mentioned earlier, I'm born and raised in Mexico, and I didn't learn about this history. So one of the goals that I have is to challenge that erasure in Mexico, but clearly also in the US, which is very needed as well today. And that goes hand in hand with challenging anti-Blackness, which, I talk about these stories, but that doesn't necessarily, and talk about freedom in Mexico, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Mexico is this ideal place where racism didn't exist, because racism is very much alive. And so I think it would be to challenge erasure of Black presence, roots, and contribution, but also challenge anti-Blackness. In Mexico, in the U.S., and across the borderlands.
All right, wonderful. And then for both of you, is there anything you want to mention before we get into the Q&A that I didn't hit on?
You've been very great, so
No,
you covered so much.
You've done great, no.
Yay! All right, so I'm getting it done. So do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, Ron. Any questions in the audience? Mm-hmm.
What made it expedient for General Gordon Granger to go to Galveston at that time?
So we asked what made it expedient for General Gordon?
Granger.
Granger. I always mix that up. Gordon Granger to go to Galveston at that time.
It's basically just a sort of breakup of the Confederacy. I mean, and the reason they're going there is, frankly, like I mentioned, Texas is pretty much untouched during the Civil War. Virginia, there's battles fought there and everything else, right? But Texas is, in some ways, slavery is almost more entrenched at the end of the Civil War than at the beginning. And in fact, when the Confederacy begins to crumble, Jefferson Davis and all of his cabinet, they're trying to flee to Texas, where they want to reestablish the Confederacy and hopefully link up with the French in Mexico, which is again why it's important to know Mexican history, and kind of reestablish the Confederacy. So Granger's going in there basically to try to prevent this reestablishment of the Confederacy in Texas. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And what I could add is that so Granger arrived to enforce federal law, which was the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed on January of 1863, stating that all people that were enslaved, not everywhere, but just in rebel states, had to be free. And Texas, as Carl mentions, refused to go by because they wanted to reestablish the Confederacy there. And so Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston in many ways to enforce that law and to notify people that or not notify people because they already knew, but many already knew, but to force slaveholders to abide by the law and free the people that they continue to hold enslaved. But even yet, the order that was read in Galveston has basically tells them, you're free, you've been free for 2 years, but you have to remain where you are, and your enslaver and you will have an agreement, he will pay you wages. And you cannot be idle, you cannot ask for assistance, nobody's going to help you. Just remain where you are, at least to the full harvest. And so, but basically that, if that answered the question, sorry.
Any other questions we would like to ask?
As far as Mr. Ellis, I think what he was doing is what we know as passing. But once he was established, it was trying to get more blacks to relocate to Mexico. Did they then discover more that he was black than Mexican?
So her question was, going back to Mr. Ellis, thinking about his concept of passing as a Mexican man, meaning taking on a new racial identity, asking once he brought other African Americans to Mexico to live a new life, did that start like the understanding that he is black?
That's a great question. There's a lot of layers to that. The first thing is the family that his American descendants actually would say that they don't think he's passing. I don't know what word they would exactly use with it, but they felt that passing means, because they did have other family members who did this, where you cut yourself off completely from the rest of your family, and it's a kind of, the word passing, of course, also can mean death, so-and-so passed, and it's a kind of social death, right? That's the reason that African Americans use that term, because it suggests you're kind of absenting yourself from the community, and in some ways it's a sort of death. And so I think because he always was in touch with his family, some of his family members feel that he wasn't passing, although we were never able to identify what this term would be. And I think it's also interesting to contemplate, too, presenting yourself as Mexican versus white. What is the difference there in the sense that, white is the oppressor class? I'm not quite sure what Mexican is, right? It's a sort of different category. But I think what you're pointing to as well, which is true, is that, and this is why he was playing this very dangerous game, because most people are involved in whatever you want to call it, this reinvention. You want to lie low. You don't want to attract attention to yourself. And by doing what he was doing, Ellis was actually, hundreds of newspapers are writing about him all around the country. And so it was very risky. And I think that demonstrates on some level his commitment to, not only achieving a liberation for himself by presenting himself as Mexican, but actually trying to share this with other African Americans at considerable risk to himself. But it also explains, and I didn't get into this in my presentation, why he eventually moves from San Antonio to New York. Because once he starts doing this in San Antonio, which isn't that far from Victoria's hometown, people begin to realize this Guillermo Eliseo is this William Ellis that we used to know. And eventually his cover is blown in San Antonio, and he has to go to New York and kind of reinvent himself all over again.
All right, we have time for one last question. Any other questions? Anything else you two want to add then?
No, just that I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm hoping at some point there'll be more in the exhibits about the Underground Railroad to Mexico. Yeah.
Where else can we find your works?
So I will be here at Ohio State, so anyone can just email me, look me up. She will have my information. Yes, this fall. And I have a website that has some documents and some small blog posts and some biographies. So ask Asia, she'll share them with you.
And also there's a William Ellis website, correct?
Yeah, there's an website, if you go to williamhellis.com, that has a lot of documents, but I believe we're also going to have books here at the bookstore.
Yes, so we'll also have The Strange Career of William Ellis at the bookstore, so feel free to purchase, and thankfully Dr. Jacoby is willing to sign them if you buy them today. So if we don't have any other questions, again, I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to come here and tell the story of trying to take a different spin on Juneteenth that's really not even different, but just another lens to a really broad story. And again, connecting it to the National Underground Railroad it's so important to expand your mind to the histories that you've already been taught. There's so much that we still don't know, but take the time to really open yourselves to these resources that people are bringing in. I mean, I myself did not know really about the Underground Railroad to Mexico, and I grew up in Texas until a few years ago. So it's a great thing that we have this ability to learn more now. Now we just got to make sure that we're taking the time and making sure it's available to others. So again, thank you so much for being here. Happy Juneteenth, and bring it. Give me another question. I love it. Yes.
You were saying that this is the subject that you were very good about in Mexico. You know very good about it here. A lot of it is not being taught. So why do you think they're fighting so hard not to teach these things in school?
The sigh. He lives in New York, so he's not dealing with these issues.
I'm really, really, really worried about this. I've been teaching for 25 years, and this is the worst attack I've ever seen on history. I mean, they say CRT, and in fact, some of the foundational figures on CRT teach at my university, but Kimberly Crenshaw, but basically it's an attack on history, and we're just trying to tell the truth. I think the first thing we're supposed to do as historians is tell as close as we can the truth, right? And it's, I don't know, it's deeply disturbing to me, but I think it's an effort to limit, that sort of famous saying, whoever controls the past controls the future. If you sort of have this very confined sense of what the past is, then it limits our potential to think about the future. I actually believe that if you're doing it right, history should be a kind of radicalizing act, and it should be a liberatory act. And I think that that's why people are worried about it, because that's the history done right will hopefully enable those things. And trying to limit what we know about history is an effort to limit possibilities of liberation, right?
What I have to say to add is that the authorities that be, like for instance, talking about Texas, because I was there for 6 years doing my PhD, thinking about Florida, and actually thinking about Ohio, whose some legislatures are trying to pass similar laws, like Texas has. And I think it's an attempt to continue perpetuating that erasure. For instance, in Texas, students, K through 12, up until 2018, when they were taught about the Civil War, they were only taught that the Civil War happened because of states' rights. They were not taught that it happened because of a challenge in slavery. And it's a major point. And so individuals like my advisor, basically, I participated in these processes because she basically pulled her students to go testify at the Texas Board of Education to try to push this to become a standard for Texas K through 12. And it was in 2018 where they passed finally that in 2019, students were going to start learning about how that slavery was a major cause of the Civil War. But then all these challenges began to sprout from those conversations, and legislatures just want to continue perpetuating the same myths and false histories that we know, or some of us know are false, but K through 12, our children do not know. So they're taught whatever teachers are allowed. Now I think that we have a lot of brave teachers out there, but that is not enough. And so I think that it is going to continue being a struggle, but we need to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, and I would say as we keep pushing forward, really go to your institutions, not really hyping us, but just these are the places where you can find those resources. So here at the Freedom Center, like I said, this lecture will be in our archival library. We have teaching sessions and symposiums. We talk about children's books and how that's really important resources for K through 12, so that they're getting that history in a way that they can understand it. So read the books, find out which books to go to your local Black institutions, your local Hispanic institutions. These are the people who are living this, these are the people who are working for it, so even if it can't be in the school, or we're pushing it to actually be in the school, do it at home. Find it outside of school, find it outside of the home. But now we're gonna end, and I wanna do another round of applause and say thank you so much. And please make sure you get Dr. Jacoby's book in our bookstore. Thank you.
It is a phenomenal book, so
It is.
to read it.
It's very good. Thank you.
Thank you.